Welcome to the start of the first major section of the course. We're now going to work with a tool called Ansible for configuration management. On this course, we're going to be starting and stopping a large group of servers many times over. Even for our basic system, which is only really the starting point for a system, we're going to have something like 10 servers running, and we're going to be constantly deploying jars and wars. We will be patching the servers, we'll be installing software, and really we'll be doing all kinds of things. I hope that it's fairly obvious that this wouldn't be practical to do it by hand. If I did that by maybe manually starting up a server instance using, for example, the AWS console, the management console, and I could do that by clicking and making selections and ultimately starting up a server. And then I would go ahead and I would log on to that server and then maybe install some software or add some patches or deploy one of my web applications or my microservices to that server. That would all be very straightforward, but it would be, first of all, very tedious, the constant clicking and so on, but it would also not be repeatable. Once I've built that server, if I needed to build another identical server, well, I'd have to remember exactly the same steps that I'd carried out. So it would be both tedious and not repeatable. What we really need is a tool to automate all of these kinds of operations for us. We could write some regular shell scripts, and you could try this. It would work, but experience shows that this kind of approach isn't very easy to manage, especially once your system goes past the non-trivial stage. As often is the case, it's better to get a tool to do the job, and the kind of tool we're looking for falls under the heading called configuration management. Here's a Wikipedia page showing a comparison of what looks like, down here, quite a long list of these so-called configuration management tools. Now, I must confess that I haven't worked with most of these, so I will let you read this page if you're really interested. But of course, what we need to do is choose one of them to do the work on this course. Just for a bit of background, I have done some work with Capistrano in the past when I worked on a Rails project. So that tool is very commonly used for deploying Rails applications. It certainly was when I worked on it. I don't know if it is now. And a big player in this area is, going down a bit, a tool called Puppet. And going back up again, you may have also heard of one called Chef. I would say that just by listening to what people are talking about, then Puppet and Chef would be two of the leading tools, along with the one that you know by now we're using for the course, and that one's called Ansible. Now, because configuration management tools are not my specialist area, I'm just a user of them, I'm not going to compare and contrast them in any great detail, and I can't really tell you which one is the best out of these. To some extent, I don't really care which is the best as long as the tool I'm using meets my needs and it has a vibrant and active community. So what I can certainly say about Ansible is there is a lot of talk about Ansible in the DevOps industry, and in my local area there are lots of conferences and meetup talks about Ansible, so it's certainly very vibrant. From a technical point of view, what I like about Ansible is, first of all, it's so-called agentless, as you can see from this column here. Now, what that means is we don't need to install Ansible on the instances that we're managing. Remember, we're going to have at least 10 separate instances for our system. With some of the other tools, we would have to install the configuration management system, a so-called agent, on each of the servers. No need with Ansible. We install Ansible once and once only on what you might call the controller computer, and then Ansible can happily work with as many remote servers as we need. And if you're interested, Ansible will simply use SSH H to communicate with those remote servers. So for some kind of comparison, you can see that Chef does require an agent and also Puppet. So that's one thing I like about Ansible, but another huge feature, and this is one that we're going to be seeing again and again and again on this course, is that it has a so-called verify mode. Actually, to be fair, Chef and Puppet do as well. This is a huge feature. That means that if we, for example, write a script that is going to install a piece of software onto a server, we run it once and it installs successfully, and then we run the same script again, Ansible will not repeat the installation. In other words, it won't repeat that task. It's going to detect, hey, the job has already been done, I don't need to do it again. And for that reason, Ansible scripts are often called idempotent. That's a term that we've used on quite a few virtual pair programmers courses. It just simply means that we can safely run and rerun our Ansible scripts safely without worrying that we're going to end up with repeating tasks. And that's especially useful when we're writing a script, when we're testing and debugging a script. Well, actually, to be accurate, in fact, an Ansible script is only idempotent if you're careful to write that script properly. But it's not that hard to do, and we will be aiming for idempotent scripts throughout this course. Anyway, enough of the comparisons. I'll wait until we start using Ansible to prove that Ansible is a good tool for what we need. The point of this discussion was just to say there are a lot of configuration management tools out there. You could probably use any of them successfully, but at the time of recording, I reckon Ansible's a good choice. So let's get started and install Ansible. Well, if you're running on Windows, then we have a problem already. Ansible can manage Windows servers, but for the Ansible client application, or I prefer to think of it as the control application, you do need to install Ansible on a Linux-based operating system. But I don't think that's much of a problem because, of course, on this course we're going to be using AWS extensively. We'll be firing up lots and lots and lots of Linux servers, and I don't think it would hurt. Well, it's going to cost a few cents maybe if we launch an AWS EC2 instance purely to work with Ansible. So the starting point is going to be the AWS console. Now, I know I said this in the introduction, but I'm going to say it again and again and again because I'm really worried about you needing to spend money. You need to make absolute sure that at the end of each session, when you've finished working, close down all of your AWS resources. That means stop any EC2 instances that are running. You might even want to terminate them. And that really can't be stressed enough because if you leave things running, then you will be racking up a bill. The other thing is you'll need to decide which region you want to run in. Now, as far as I know, for this course, you could choose any of the regions. I don't think there's anything specific to a region that we'll be doing on this course. So probably what you want to do is choose a region quite close to you so that you get good performance. I'm going to choose EU Ireland because it's close to where I'm recording, but you can go for any of the others. Okay, if you follow the link to EC2, we'll start by launching a very basic Linux server that we can run all of our Ansible scripts from. So we'll click on Launch Instance. For this machine, we'll use the basic Amazon Linux AMI. By the way, of course, I said in the introduction that we want to use Ansible to do all of the work of creating servers for us and installing software on it. Well, unfortunately, of course, we can't do that just yet because we haven't yet installed Ansible. So this is going to be one of the few manual processes that I follow. Now, you might know that you can use the command line to manage AWS, and that really is the proper way of doing things. But I personally prefer, when I'm recording videos, to use the console because it simply looks better. But if you're familiar with the AWS command line tools, you could use those as well. But whichever way you use it, on step 2 for the instance type, I'm going to suggest that we go for the T2 Nano instance. This is the smallest and least powerful instance type that AWS supports. Now, this may have changed by the time you watch this video. The 2 is the generation number of that instance type. And it may well be by the time you watch this that they've moved on to the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th generation, which in general would just mean it's more powerful for the same cost. The T means it's a so-called burstable instance, which means that although you can get CPU power out of this instance, you can only get them for very small bursts. And really what that means is that this instance type is not going to be high performance. Well, I've discovered that in recording this course that the T2 Nano does seem to be perfectly suitable for doing the kind of Ansible work that we're doing. So to keep costs down, I'm going to work with the T2 Nano. But if you ever find when you're working on this that you get any kind of out-of-memory errors or any really strange crashes, or maybe your instance even simply stops working, it might be because your instance type isn't quite powerful enough, and you might want to look at using one of the more expensive types. If you are brand new to AWS, then you may be eligible for the free tier, which will give you access to a micro instance, which is a little more powerful than the Nano instance. So if that's available to you, you can try doing that. However, you're only going to get one instance on the free tier, and we're going to be starting 10 or more of these on the course. So unfortunately, you can't really use the free tier for this course. So T2 Nano is the one I recommend. On the next step, we don't have to do anything specific. We'll click Next. This is where we could increase the storage on the machine. We don't need to. Click Next. Now we should give this instance a name, and I'm going to suggest something like Ansible Control. Doesn't really matter. For the security group, all we need to be able to do with this instance is to be able to log into it using SSH. So I suggest that you click on Create New Security Group, and you should find that the defaults are that port 22 will be open. That will allow us to log into this instance using SSH. And for the source, check that, well, there's two options here. If you go for custom and then you go for the 0.0.0.0/0 option, that will allow you to log in from anywhere. If you are security conscious, then you could select My IP, and that will only allow you to be able to access that port. Be careful if you do that, because of course if you have a dynamic IP address, then at any time in the future your IP address might change, and then you'll find you can't log in. So we're not really doing anything important with this Ansible controller, and I'm going to be disposing of it anyway quite soon, so I'm happy to go with anywhere. So we get a chance to review, but the next option is to launch. And now for a really important step on the course. We are going to be creating lots of these instances. And although you could create a new key pair for every single instance, that would be really tedious. For the work we are doing on the course, I'm going to suggest that what we do is we create a new key pair, give your key pair a name. So I'm going to go for Microservice Course Key Pair. And then, really importantly, we'll click on Download Key Pair. Now, the file that you end up with here, you need to keep safe, because you will need this file to be able to log into your instance. If you lose that file, then you won't be able to log into your instances anymore. That won't actually be that massive a disaster, because almost all of the work we're doing on this course, we're going to write scripts that will allow you to automatically recreate everything at the touch of a button. If you did need to go through this process again, you could always create a new key pair and then just run your scripts again. And you'd have a whole new set of instances with a clean set of login credentials. But I recommend you keep that file pretty safe, at least for now. So we're going to click on Launch Instances, and it will take a few minutes for your instance to launch. So I've just waited about 30 seconds or so, and now if I go to View Instances, you should be able to find your Ansible control machine, and most importantly of all, you should be seeing it's reporting it now has a public IP address. That appears here and here. I'm going to take a copy of that IP address and now over to the command line. As I described in the opening section of this course, if you're running on Windows, I recommend something like Cygwin, which I have here. If you're on Mac or Linux, then you can use the built-in terminal emulators. And I've created a local folder on my computer here, and importantly, what I have in there is that keypair.pem file that we just downloaded a few moments ago. And you should know this. You should now be able to log into your instance by using SSH-I followed by your keypair.pem file, and then on the Amazon machines, the username is ec2-user at, and then the IP address that we've just copied from the Amazon console. The first time that you're logging in, it will give you a fingerprint warning, and we can just say, yes, we do want to continue connecting. And hopefully you're now on the command line of your instance. If there's any kind of connection problem there, then it may be the case that your instance is still starting, so give it a few more minutes. That would be quite a common problem. Now we need to install Ansible, and this is really simple and straightforward. Ansible is a Python program, and luckily with this particular machine instance, using the Amazon Linux AMI, we already have Python installed. This happens to be version 2.7 of Python. We don't need to use Python at all, but what we can do is use the associated Python program called pip, which is, I don't know if you know this, but it is the Python package manager. It's a tool for installing Python programs. And all I have to do, actually I'll probably need to do this under sudo. So sudo pip install Ansible should download and install Ansible. Now I'm aware that, of course, over time these Amazon Linux AMIs will change and versions will go out of date and so on. So if you've followed along with me and you've had any problems at installing this, I can see a version warning there, but that's clearly not very important. If you've not been able to install Ansible, then do contact us through the support page at Virtual Pair Programmers, because I would hate to think of you not being able to carry on with the course just because of some minor Python version problem. I do get a lot of Python version problems. If you've installed Ansible, then we're pretty much there. If I just type in Ansible, I'm getting the usual help page, massive list of options. Ansible is there. And so we're all ready to play with Ansible now, which we'll do in the next video.